redeemed, rehabilitated, and real entertaining. This is the Carl Jackson Podcast.
All right, welcome to the Carl Jackson Show podcast on this Friday. This is your daily dose of objective truth in a world of confusion and lies. Guys, you are going to love today's podcast. I'll be honest with you. We intended to air this yesterday. We had a bunch of technical difficulties. Our guest was gracious enough to come back today. We're going to be talking about the Idaho murders. There's been a lot of new revelations that have come up. We want to discuss. And what's funny is you guys didn't get to see it because we didn't get to air it yesterday. But my guest was spot on yesterday when it came to this murderer or alleged murderer. OK, but it's so funny. So we'll get into that as well. Dr. Currie Myers, welcome back to the Carl Jackson Show podcast.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks so much. And Happy New Year to you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. So we wanted to air this yesterday. You were telling me some stuff that was spot on. I was sitting there talking to my wife and I was like, dude, this guy, last night I was like, he was spot on. So anyway, very exciting to have you back. Dr. Currie Myers, would you just right off the bat, give people your information, where they can find you, and give us a little bit of street cred, if you will, why, so people understand why I'm bringing you onto the podcast to talk about this or these Idaho murders.
Well, thanks again. And thanks for the kind words. So I have a background of not only academics, but crime fighting. So I spent 25 years in law enforcement. I started out as a state trooper, went to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and spent the vast majority of my career at the KBI as a special agent. A lot of that time was spent in drug investigations, was farmed out to the U.S. Department of Justice, DEA, for 5 years. Then I went over to the field and was a homicide detective, a homicide special agent for the KBI. We focused on homicides, public corruption, police corruption. And then I was very blessed to be able to be elected sheriff of Johnson County, Kansas. It's the largest sheriff's office in the Midwest. Johnson County is actually the most populated county in the Kansas City metropolitan area. So it's a county that serves about 650,000 population, and the sheriff's office there is very large. When I was still on the job, I went back to graduate school. I received my PhD in criminal justice, focused a lot on organizational systems, and naturally studied a lot on criminological theory. And then I also went back and got my MBA. I've been a professor an adjunct professor at Benedictine College. I'm entering into my 12th year there on faculty in the criminology department. And I'm also a consultant. So I was a senior fellow for the Texas Public Policy Foundation for 4 years. And then I went to Americans for Prosperity. And I've been a criminologist and a criminal justice public policy advisor for them for the last year and a half. You can view my work. I'm on Substack at drcurriemyers.com, substack.com, drcurriemyers.substack.com, and you can view all my writing. I do a weekly podcast. I wrote most recently about the advent of feral man, which talks about the wilding of humans right now, especially in America. And last, I'm a signatory along with AFP on a project called endviolentcrime.com. And our focus is to focus on violent crime, number one. Number two, funding for law enforcement, and not through fines, fees, or forfeitures, but by actual general funds. And number three, we focus on evidence-based policing. That means we have facts right in front of us and data right in front of us to make policing decisions. And last but not least, smart on crime policies. And that's endviolentcrime.com.
And you, again, forensic research, you're excellent at forensic research. Guys, I mean, you just heard that resume. I wanted you to hear that because Doctor, I was so impressed by him yesterday. And if you guys would just understand, I mean, what happened yesterday was absolutely crazy. We sat there like, oh man, this is going to be such a great podcast when it goes out. And then we were like, oh, it didn't record all of it. So anyway, so I'm so glad to have him back today. And Dr. Currie, I'm going to be sitting in on the nationally syndicated show, Officer Tatum, a few times next week. I want to have you on his show because I want to be able, I want the national audience to be able to hear your voice, and hopefully more people in national media will seek you out, because I mean, you were spot on yesterday, and we'll get into some of this stuff today. I'll start off with the same question that I asked yesterday here, Doctor. How do you guys, I'm thinking of the crime scene that happened in Idaho, blood spatter everywhere, literally oozing through the side of the house. You yourself have been a part of investigating homicides, obviously, as one of the largest, or in one of the largest Midwestern areas, sheriff's counties. How do you guys deal with this and not absolutely go crazy, go nuts? I can barely stomach watching the first 48 hours. How do you handle something like that?
Well, I think first, not everybody in law enforcement. I think once you get into law enforcement, everybody has different directions that they want to go into. Some of it is undercover drug work, and some people are very good at it, and some police officers are horrible at it. I think the same thing occurs for working homicides. It takes a certain character, a certain person. You have to have attention to detail because you got to be extremely focused. You can't be bothered by some of those things. We all get bothered internally by it. I'm not saying it doesn't. We don't go home at night and suffer from what we've seen, the day before, the evening before. But I think more often you focus on your training. You have to understand that you're in there to solve a crime. You have to understand that you're in there to, I call it, you're working for God, because, more than likely, if you're there, there's nobody alive and nobody knew what happened in that crime scene except the suspect and God. So you're representing, the family and representing the community and trying to solve a case. So it's extremely important. You have to stay focused. I think those of us in first responders, even in the medical community, first responders, that's the reason we all get along so well, is we have kind of a warped sense of humor. So that's something that occurs as a result of trying to let off steam. For me, it wasn't until I really had more of a connection in my faith life where I turned to Christ and God as someone that I could talk to. I've been very blessed with a wonderful wife for 35 years, and I have 5 children and 9 grandchildren, and so I have a stable home environment. And unfortunately, in law enforcement, we have high divorce, we have high alcoholism, and all those kinds of things as we deal with stress. But I think family and faith probably is the most significant thing in a person's life, and especially if you're under high stress careers like in law enforcement, and particularly a homicide detective that is extremely busy in larger cities.
Good. I mean, good answer. I'm congratulations on the family. I think that is a big deal, a huge deal. I love the way you framed how you're going into these crime scenes and you're working for God. I mean, you're working for the victim, you're working for God, you're working for the community, trying to figure out who did this. But obviously, with the suspect that's trying to hide, disappear, whatever, you want to bring justice to this world, and it is a calling for sure here. Okay, Doc. So here's what I want to get into. I got to brag on this guy. We new details emerged yesterday. And this was hours after we had recorded the initial podcast. And again, it blew up in our faces, but I'm glad, again, that he's back today. But he started saying yesterday, I was sitting here thinking, man, this has taken such a long time. Was the crime scene just so messy that it was way too difficult for the police officers to do something? Were they inexperienced? Was this killer just brilliant and, whatever? And he was like, I don't think he was as good as you think. And I was like, okay, man, Doc, you hit the nail on the head. Some of the new details that have emerged, this guy, it's almost as if he wanted to get caught. And I'm not saying he did, but he was so sloppy. He left a sheath behind. You said yesterday that there's no perfect crime. Essentially, how was it that you were so confident without knowing all these details that there had to be so much more there, and you were so confident that this guy wasn't as good as we thought, as I thought, for sure?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to note that only a small percentage of homicides end up being where you have somebody who is a true psychopathic killer that has the patience, that has the mentality to conceal evidence. But it's called Locard's theory, exchange theory, and basically the thought is whoever goes into a crime scene, you're going to carry something in. And if you go out of a crime scene, you're going to carry something out. And Locard wrote about this generations ago, a long time ago. And so it was true in 1700, wow. And it's true today, that if you walk into a crime scene, you are going to carry something into that crime scene. And if you walk out, you're going to carry something out of that crime scene. Now, it may be trace evidence, it may be extremely small. And I think that's why DNA in particular has become such an important, I think it's probably one of the most important inventions from a criminal justice systems point of view that has ever been invented. For a while it was fingerprints, but DNA is now the reason we're convicting people, we're finding people, and it's the reason we're exonerating people who were arrested and were either framed for a murder or the law enforcement got the wrong person. So it's worked to the advantage of both good, and it's worked to the advantage of letting out people who have been falsely imprisoned. So these are two important things. I think the other one is technology. The advent of technology has been a huge friend of ours. When I started working homicides back a long time ago, and this was a long time ago, I started in 1985 in my police career. And so we didn't even have cell phones when I first started.
Oh man,
so
it's hard to fathom.
Yeah, so the technology has been your friend. So when I was a homicide detective, time was not your friend. You really had 48 to 72 hours to try to make sure that you had some sort of understanding who suspects were, and you had to work very hard, and you had to interview a lot of people, and you had to go to a lot of different places. And now with forensic science has gotten better 1,000% than what it was, 30 years ago. And it keeps improving each and every year. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned with constitutionality. I think anytime we have DNA use, and in this particular case, we had a re-engineering DNA, basically, with what was done. There needs to be guardrails in place. I don't know what law enforcement did from a authority point of view to get that information, whether it was provided to them by the genealogical company or whether they received some sort of subpoena from the court, or perhaps a subpoena ducis tecum, which is from the prosecutor for documents. It'll be curious to see how they collected that information. And to also technology. The more video cameras we have, CCTV. In this case, the cell phone was extremely important.
Yep.
In the collection of evidence in this case. And the cell phone, CCTV and the cell phones were the first ones that I think drew attention to this individual suspect. And then DNA, once they identified it, that's when they went in and did a re-engineering of DNA. So I think the first thing was the white Hyundai Elantra was caught on CCTV camera, TV camera,
right,
leaving the scene or close to leaving the scene. Then it was picked back up at Washington State University. He went back to Washington State University, and CCTV cameras at the campus apparently picked that vehicle back up. And then the cell phone ping. So we had cell phone pings going up to the time of the murder. Apparently the suspect turned off his cell phone because we didn't have any pings. And then as he left the scene, he turned it back on, and we started to see cell phone pings from towers again as he left the crime scene. So,
go ahead, Doc.
No, I just said that's the kind of technology that we're dealing with today. And we also have cell phone geofencing. So if you don't know what geofencing is, it's even things like in your show, if someone enjoys your show and you have a live show and they come to the audience, you can have a geofence set up where anybody who came in with a cell phone, you could actually send them a text saying, "Thank you for coming to my show." And so universities have a lot of geofencing because it's a marketing thing. If a student comes, or prospective student, they want to communicate with that student, and they use geofencing to collect the phone data and then put that information back out. If you go to a retail store, Walmart's, anything like that, generally it's set up in some sort of geofencing. So a lot of people go, how did they know I was I got a text message from X, Y, and Z saying, thanks for shopping. It's because they have geofencing. And in this case, I'm pretty sure there was some geofencing information that was there.
I got to tell. I mean, that's obviously that's amazing to know. I recently read about geofencing in regards actually to the J6 protesters. I'll leave that topic for another day. Maybe we'll have to have you back on to talk about geofencing. But I mean, obviously there would be some constitutionality concerns in my mind. But obviously, just sticking to this case, you're absolutely right. I mean, the guy. Apparently, that vehicle had passed by that house several occasions over the span of several months, at least a dozen times, and then throughout the night. So obviously the police had they had someone in mind. They had a fingerprint on the knife sheath, which I'm sitting there thinking, I cannot believe he left that behind. But you'll be able to explain that. You talked to me yesterday, Doc, about this it seemed to you that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there were 4 victims. I don't think there's any real connection to these victims, but it seems as though this guy it was like a crime of passion, a crime of rage. And so even though he may have, or maybe he didn't, but may have focused on one individual person, he was just in this state of rage where that rage just turns against everyone. And even though this guy is a smart guy, he didn't pull off a murder very smartly, thank God.
Yeah, I think there were some in some of my colleagues were saying that he was, and some people in the media were saying this guy. I think they conflate someone who might have a higher academics and maybe intellect as being successful automatically. I think that's perhaps a cognitive bias that you have sometimes. But just because you're working on a PhD, and it has to be specifically in criminology, and you've done some research on previous serial killers, that's certainly important information. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be an expert in going in and committing a murder and knowing how to get away with it. As we talked yesterday, I thought it was a very chaotic crime scene. I thought it was a very disorganized crime scene. It didn't look like. Now, I'm not saying that he doesn't have the pathology for a serial killer. In fact, he has a lot of those. If you look at the profile for a serial killer, 24 to 38, white male, intellectual, lacks empathy, lacks being genuine, usually has awkward social skills, probably was bullied when he was young, which apparently that occurred in high school. He may have even hurt animals, those kinds of things when he was young. All of those things, he meets the markers. So I'm not saying someday he couldn't have, been someone that, could have been a serial killer. But in this particular case, to me, it was all about rage. I do believe he planned going into there. I think probably what happened is he was a stalker of some sort. And it's so easy to stalk young people today because they have an online footprint that they're not careful of, and you can stalk them. It could be he was a graduate student, teaching assistant over at Washington State, and it's not uncommon for other colleges to co-share curriculum sometimes, or say that you can. Let's say you don't have a curriculum of criminology at your current college because it's smaller, that Washington State does, and you want to take it as an elective, as an example. So maybe one of the victims decided to take, oh, this is cool. I'm going to go take an elective on criminal justice, and it's going to talk about serial killers. And so you decide to go take that class, and it's a lower level class where big universities, you're probably going to get a teaching assistant that's a PhD student that's going to teach that class, as opposed to the professor itself. So there could be, I'm not saying there is, but there could be a chance that he may have even taught one of the students if they crossed over into Washington State and took that curriculum. But I like to base things on the laws of probability. I think you get in trouble when you start speculating on the really wild stuff.
Right.
And when I looked at this crime scene, when I looked at the evidence that was coming in, to me, it was extremely violent. It appeared to be rage. I think he planned at the last minute to go in, because he certainly was there at the crime scene. He had a knife. He had apparently a mask. So he had tried to protect himself. He had gloves. So that's showing some, pre-planning to go ahead. But once he broke in, there's definitely, he had a targeted person in mind. And the sheath was found next to the body of one of the victims, one of the girls, and that's more than likely the victim that he had been stalking and had some sort of a relationship with. And I might say, when I say relationship, I don't say that's mutual.
Right.
The person may not have even known him that well. Maybe he was kind of weird and came up to them a few times, and they were spurned. He was spurned by the victims. We don't know what eventually set him off in particular to make him do things for that night. But he certainly had a personality where he had a powder keg. And of course, once you're in there, you go into what's called a blood rage, and you start attacking anything and everything. And if you hear somebody scream, you go up and, you deal with that. I'm sure by the end of that murder, he was probably exhausted and walked out, and you don't have all your faculties when you're mentally and physically exhausted. And we now know, of course, there was two people in the crime scene.
Yes, that's another thing. Yeah.
It was in the basement, and everybody's going, why didn't they know? Well, there's been interviews with people who have lived in that house, and it's pretty secluded. The basement's pretty secluded. But at the last minute, as he's walking out, one of the people who survived that did see a person, not him, did see a person in a mask walk out of the house. Now, a phone call wasn't made to the police for a couple hours after that. So we can't be too rough on this individual. I think more than likely what occurred, that person heard something at the very end. Again, they were out late nights partying, so they could have been intoxicated. They're down in a basement where it's muffled. Maybe that one person finally heard something, came up, saw the person leave, and then they walked into a horrendous crime scene. And I'm not sure if they suffered from some significant mental health issues immediately, even PTSD or shock that could have occurred. And you don't know what people are going to do when that happens, and maybe even passed out. So you don't know what.
It's such a good point. I'm sorry to interrupt you here, Doc, but it's such a good point to make, because once I found this out too, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, but finding out the new information way back in the day, I was a victim of a violent crime. I reacted in a way that was differently because I was doing stupid stuff. So I fought back. But I've spoken to people that have not, some people that have frozen. So when I heard that, and it was primarily a girl that happened to look outside of the door on 3 separate occasions when she heard some noise. I have no idea if she was intoxicated or not, or what have you. Then this person walks past her, right past her, apparently. And I'm sitting there thinking, what is it? Fight, flight. There's another freeze. Some people freeze. And you're right. I'm sitting there thinking maybe apparently she once she saw him, went back into the room, locked the door, and I'm like, she probably hunkered down, passed out, fell asleep. Who knows? But it doesn't surprise me. I know people are going at her. Maybe we'll find out something later, but it doesn't surprise me. And I want you to speak to this too, Doc, because I think we live in such an evil, fallen world. Everyone believes that this type of stuff can't happen to them. And maybe it's because I'm a little hyper vigilant, because over 20 years ago I was the victim of a violent crime. I'm just like, you don't know. You don't know what can happen. You don't know when it could happen. You could be completely unsuspecting. You can be in Moscow, Idaho, where there's hardly ever any issues, one murder in 7 years. And then all of a sudden you have this occur.
Yeah, and to your point for this particular visit, don't ever forget Maslow's hierarchy of needs of self-preservation. So there's a chance that person thought maybe they haven't left, and if I do anything, they're going to come kill me. And Good. So there's a lot of times you hunker down until you don't hear anything, and then you come out. So self-preservation is happens a lot in this. To your point, we have to, in my opinion, we have to be situationally aware more than ever, because not only do we have physical threats of the past, just like you and I would have had, but now we have social threats of the past that we've never engaged before, except in the last 15 to 20 years. And I'd say it's even more so just in the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. So our online footprint is so significant that we have to be constantly situationally aware, and our presence is always known. And if you're a bad actor, and I do believe the devil walks this earth, and I do believe he has minions that try to find people, and that's the reason you have to be. I think I mentioned yesterday, you have to be careful when you do research.
Yes.
On these folks. I speak to my students often who say that they want to do research on individuals. I set them down and I talk about guardrails and things that they shouldn't do and should do in doing in the collection of this research. Number one, I teach at a Catholic university, so we're very open about faith and formation and those kinds of things. But I want to make sure and prepare the student that they have to understand that you never want to let evil into your brain. You never want to let evil into you without having some form of coming back and talking to somebody or a faith life. Because if you do a lot of research, especially on serial killers, they're psychopaths, they're con men, they're charming. And if you speak to them especially, then you can be lost in that evil. So you have to be extremely careful. But the average citizen today, crime has increased. There's no question about it. Violent crime in particular has increased. And so we have to be very situationally aware. You have to know at all times what you're doing, where you're going. We're way too connected to our phones. We're looking down. We're walking around. Everything is driven by, we're kind of like zombies walking around with our phones telling us where to go and what to do. And it makes for ripe pickings of someone who wants to stalk and kill or potentially rape somebody. So you have to be, carjackings are up 42%. We're seeing in my Substack, drcurriemyers.substack.com, I write about the advent of feral man, where we have more crimes that are being committed in packs. So we have robberies that are being committed in packs of 8 and 10.
Wow.
We have burglaries that are being committed in packs of 8 and 10. We have retail theft where we have packs of 20 or 30 people going into stores and overwhelming. The criminal justice system has never seen this kind of criminal activity in mass ever. And so law enforcement's now being faced with not only focus on going after criminals, but going after criminal packs that are doing these crimes together. I don't think there's any evidence to show that this person had any other person helping them in this. It appears to me that it was done by him. I still believe that it's an act of aggression against an individual, and the other victims just happened to be there. And
Wow.
he went on a blood rage. So we're
Man.
going to, the interesting part is we're going to see more and more information, every day that comes out of this. And we actually, I think yesterday we talked about the importance of other DNA and fingerprints. Well, yesterday they came out with the fingerprint on the sheath of the knife. They came out, I think yesterday I talked about footprints. Well, they have a footprint, a shoe print that they found at the scene that would be able to be matched against the suspect's shoes, because they would go back and match those. We don't know whether or not, he went to the bathroom and urinated. We don't know if he cleaned himself in the stool. So that's where detectives are going to be looking.
Let me stop you there, Doc, because that was a very important point. I forgot that you made that point yesterday, because it fascinated me to hear this. But obviously, as a guy who's investigated tons of homicides, I never even contemplated this, never even heard about this before. Frankly, you made a great point as far as your students researching serial killers too, especially. I mean, evil can get into your head, and God knows what the devil can do with it if you don't put up some guardrails, if you will. But you made this point yesterday, and I as God is my witness, I'd never heard of that before. But you said that sometimes in events like occurred in Moscow, Idaho, a killer will use the restroom. Even, urinate, defecate. That shocked me. I'm sitting there thinking, there's no way they would do that. It's kind of in and out, but that just isn't the case. That isn't reality.
Yeah, you can't. It doesn't happen all the time, but you can't make. I think in law enforcement, especially as a homicide detective, you can't assume anything. You've got to always say, well, this is probable. And so it's probable. They did probably a lot of illumination through black light to be able to pull up, either semen, blood. That was, of course, as chaotic as the scene was, there would have been a lot that would have been detected through illumination. But that's when you also take luminol and put it into the sink and see whether or not he went over. If he stabbed somebody, he may have went over to the sink and washed his hands. He may have washed the knife off. You just never know what they could have done. And so you want to be able to look at the traps of the sink, pull potential evidence out of that. I've done that before in cases where I pulled the traps out of the sink and there was hair fibers that was associated with the suspect. And so there's been suspects before that will stop and eat something out of the refrigerator or take a drink out of something. So you just never know the behavior of a person. It's not uncommon for, especially on sexual assaults, for a person to masturbate somewhere in the house or over the victim. That happens some in burglaries as well, aggravated burglaries as well. So when I hear law enforcement talk sometimes about, well, we're going to cut down on investigating burglaries because we don't have the time, there is a percentage of burglaries that occur because people have sexual deviation and they actually are breaking into people's homes because it's a sexual attraction, and they may be in there and masturbating. And the problem is, once they do it a couple times, that's when they may take another leap and then actually go into a rape. And so, all these crimes are very important to work. And, we're seeing now with sometimes law enforcement where they're saying, well, we don't have time to go work burglaries anymore. And I get it, because we have, funding cuts and manpower issues and recruitment issues. But burglaries are very important to work because of finding those kinds of sexual deviants.
Because it could lead to higher crimes. Gabe, I'm getting a little bit of an echo here, because it can lead to higher crimes. This is such a fabulous point. Doc, I want to ask you a couple of more questions. And again, we're speaking to Dr. Currie Myers. I'm going to have him on Officer Tatum's show next week. I want everyone to hear hear this guy. I just think he's fascinating. This is so fascinating to me. It's a little eerie. I don't know how you would stomach this stuff as a career. It's obviously a calling. Doc, let me ask you this. Actually, a couple of questions. Does a knife being used always indicate or often at least, a crime of passion? And two, looking at, I was thinking this guy could possibly be a serial killer, assuming that, assuming we got the right guy, and I believe it is, but allegedly. Do you think this guy is a serial killer? Do you think he's killed before? After the info came out yesterday, I'm like, I don't think he did, but I don't know. You've investigated stuff like this before.
I think to your first point on the knife, edge. No, it's not necessarily always attributed to this. Actually, a knife is a very effective edge weapon, and serial killers often pick knives because it's quiet. It does an effective job. It doesn't bring notoriety. You can get rid of it quick. You can carry it more concealed quickly. So knife is a very effective weapon. And yesterday we talked about blood splatter. So there's going to be a huge, enormous amount of blood splatter in this particular crime scene, or there was. And blood splatter is another very important forensic tool. You can actually find out what kind of edged weapon it was by the pattern of the blood that goes into the air. So if I do a hacking movement with a hatchet, the blood splatter is going to be different in the room than if I take a knife and cut people. More often than not, you're not going to see people kill people in this kind of movement because it's awkward. Most people are going to come in and do hacking like that, but you can tell the difference in blood splatter between this movement and that movement. You can tell the difference in blood splatter in the type of edged weapon it is. The wound on the body, on the head, is going to be different. A hammer is going to have a different impact wound than an edged weapon or a knife or an axe, for instance. If I take the front of a hammer, the blunt end, that's going to have a different impact onto the brain, and it could have a different blood splatter going back than the opposite side of the hammer. Naturally, can go deeper into the wound. The FBI has a database that they've put together for centuries on different type of edge weapons, and they could actually take the picture of the wounds of the person and be able to go back into the database and be able to say that could narrow it down to maybe even 5 different types of blunt instruments or edge weapons. So
fascinating.
That's the reason it's important to get the FBI back on track and get them focused on violent crime again and less on intelligence gathering type things. So
totally agree.
I'm adding my kind of personal thing there because the
FBI, I agree. I would totally agree with you. I mean, this is fascinating information, and they're obviously specialized in some things, and they should get back.
Us at the state level and the local level, the FBI of 20 years ago is what we need again back to help us. That's the agents in the field today work very hard, but we need that kind of assistance back again of the one of the greatest law enforcement agencies in the history of the world.
Man, that's a good word. Serial killer, Doc, do you think this was this guy's first time? You think he's struck before? One would think because it's so violent, but then again, he was so sloppy. As again, you told me yesterday this guy isn't as good as you think. So going based upon that, I'm like, maybe this was his first time. He was very sloppy.
Yeah, I don't know. To me, it doesn't. I think he probably has stalked before.
Okay.
It's probably evident that that's probably not a first time. There certainly appears to be some sort of sexual dysfunction there. So I think as we get into this more and examine his online footprint, examine some other people that may come forward and say, yeah, he came up to me and acted weird. So I think he probably was a serial stalker, and probably one of the reasons he was attracted to teaching is because he's going to teach young people at a college, and that gives you access, to being in front of them and being in control of them. And
those girls were very beautiful, very beautiful girls.
They were, and being an authority figure. So I have a feeling that he probably, if he is serial anything, he's probably a serial stalker. But it looks like and again, it's not that he doesn't meet the markers of a serial killer. In fact, he does. I just don't think he had gotten there. Now, if he had gotten away with this, maybe he would have had a taste for it. I don't know.
This is, I mean, again, this has been fascinating, Doc. Let me ask you this as a last question here, and then I'm going to ask you to hold just for a couple of minutes to make sure we have everything. Then I got to get your personal contact because I want to have you on national air next week, so we can just chat for an entire hour if you don't mind. Social media and the advent of it. You've talked about this some. I'd like to know, have you seen a market increase of crime with the advent of social media? Obviously, the stalking is an issue. You mentioned that people can stalk you from online now, so it definitely makes things different. So people have to be careful of what they throw up on social media. But have you seen a rise in crime, and can we trace it to the advent of social media?
In the last 10 years, we've seen a rise in homicides. We've seen a rise in rapes. We've seen a rise in robberies, and we've seen a rise in carjackings. We've seen a drop off in property crimes. So in the last 10 years, those are things we see. I make the argument that property crimes are difficult to gain data on because a lot of people don't report anymore. They get frustrated because police aren't taking the cases anymore, because they even say, if you go to some websites, hey, we don't respond to this type of case anymore.
Wow.
And there is also the fact that some agencies don't report to the FBI in a timely manner violations of criminal law. So there's a backlog. This is why this is so important, and this is why I signed on to the End Violent Crime as a signatory, because we want to focus on evidence-based policing. You can't do that if we don't have real information and real data in real time. And there is a huge infrastructure problem in law enforcement where we don't have data immediately. Some of the bigger agencies do, but we need data immediately so law enforcement agencies can make decisions quickly on utilization of resources and where to put out hot spots and fires. And right now, information is so historic that it becomes useless in terms of actionable information. So if there's going to be anything that America needs to focus on, is we need to fund police appropriately, but we need an up-to-date criminal data system that collects information immediately, where law enforcement can respond to crime in real time and actually have a major impact.
Man, Dr. Currie Myers, I got to tell you, I got to thank you for being willing to, obviously it has to be a calling, but to go into this line of work. You're extremely informative. You're extremely methodical and strategic. I can see that in just the way that you speak of these issues, and you've answered my questions. And you know, for all of you that are out there and you hate the police, well, your family member gets killed, your family member is a part of a crime, you're going to be the first to call 911. So we need to make sure that we pray for our police officers, first responders, law enforcement. Obviously, in any profession, there is always going to be a bad apple because we live in a fallen world. No one's going to be perfect. There's only one that's perfect, and I believe that's Jesus Christ. So we have to remember that. But I got to just thank you for being willing to go into a field like you've done over the years. And obviously you're teaching now and you're a consultant and writing. And, I mean, you were obviously in the thick of it, and that isn't for everybody. But we need you guys in law enforcement. And so I just feel propelled to just thank you, Doc. I appreciate that you've gone into this field.
Well, thank you so much. I was very blessed. It wasn't without some pain, throughout those careers, but I was very, very blessed in the men and women out in the field now need our prayers every day, because they're facing things that I would have never faced back before. There are opportunities improvement for us in law enforcement in the criminal justice field. I write about those often, so I recognize that we have opportunities for improvement. But a lot of the things that we've done in criminal justice public policy in the last couple of years were not right. So we need to focus on fixing some of the issues that have been occurring, and we went way overboard on attacking a criminal justice system and almost putting it where thinking that we don't need it. We have prosecutors that are acting on their own and not following state statutes. We have police departments that aren't being funded. There's been reduction in funding across the board in the last couple of years in law enforcement. We have police officers that are retiring in droves, taking early retirement. It's hard to recruit police officers. These are the unintended consequences of a very fragile system. But we do recognize that we have to improve and be better community servants. So it's mutually important for us in our profession and law enforcement profession to understand that we have to do a better job, but it's also important for the public to protect us and have our back.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Dr. Currie Myers, will you again, Doc, tell everybody where they can find you on social media, where they can find your Substack, and you spell Currie, Currie, Myers, Myers. Okay, well, go ahead, Doc.
That's correct. Yeah, drcurriemyers.substack.com is where I do all my writing and research, and I have a weekly podcast as well. It's usually audio, and it's kind of on current trends that are occurring. And then you can also view inviolentcrime.com. That's going to give you more information about this special group that we're putting together that's going to focus on violent crime, funding for police, evidence-based policing, and smart on crime policies. That's inviolentcrime.com.
And as an END?
Yes.
Okay. Endviolentcrime.com. Okay.
Yep.
All right. I love that. All right, guys, listen, I appreciate you tuning in to this edition of the Carl Jackson Show podcast. I'm going to encourage you to subscribe to the podcast wherever podcasts are found. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and Rumble. Check out the YouTube channel. Subscribe there. Check out our Rumble channel. We really want to grow our numbers on rumble.com. It is a free speech YouTube, like YouTube used to be. So it's the free speech version. So if you go to rumble.com, make sure you subscribe there. Find us on social media, The Carl Jackson Show. Again, check out Dr. Currie, drcurrie.substack.com. Also, violent.com. It's been a blessing to have you on, Doc. This is some pretty morbid stuff, but God calls people to different things. Someone has to handle this type of business. I'm glad there's people out there like you that do. So God bless you for all that you've done. And I really appreciated you coming on, and I really enjoyed this podcast. I love learning, and I learned a lot from you. Really did.
Well, you do an excellent job, so I appreciate it. I actually enjoyed it very much, and it's nice to be able to have more in-depth interviews like this instead of 3 or 4 minutes. So it's able to really get information and be able to have a nice natural flow. So kudos on the show and the great work that you do every day. So I appreciate it. Honored to come on again and appear with you on any other shows that you may be doing down the road.
All right. I'm going to take you up on that, Doc, starting next week. So we'll have you on the Officer Tatum. I look forward to it. The national audience needs to hear about you. So I really appreciate it. So guys, I appreciate you tuning in. And until next time, don't forget to support MyPillow, mypillow.com, American-made products, American jobs. They're not outsourcing anything. All right, so mypillow.com, use the promo code Carl. Just go to click the radio listener special at the top of the page, or give them a call, 1-800-858-0263. And until next time, don't grow weary doing good. God bless you.